What is up, guys? Welcome back. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome to 2020. Happy New Year. I hope you had an amazing holiday season. If you're new to this channel, this is where we talk about Formula One, Formula E, motorsport in general, cars, technology, gadgets. If you're into those things, stick around. Today, specifically, we're going to be talking about Formula One engines, energy recovery systems, crash testing. We're going to be talking about Red Bull and their relationship with Max Verstappen, amongst many, many other things. And of course, there is an appointment to view tonight. If you haven't already set your video recorders, I'm going to tell you exactly when and where you need to be this evening to watch my new show, Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car. For now though, welcome back, as I say, welcome to another Ask Elvis. Right, as I say, welcome back. I do hope you had a great time over Christmas. For us, it was lovely, just family orientated, didn't go anywhere, stayed at home, which was great. I'd love to know what you got up to. Was there any motorsport involvement over the Christmas period, or was it a complete shutdown? For me, I barely even looked at social media. Actually, it was really nice just to switch off. But I noticed yesterday, 10 weeks until the first Grand Prix in Australia. 10 weeks. I mean, it seems like a lifetime away, but actually it's not very far, is it? It feels like a good point to start a countdown as well. And of course, there's loads happening way before we get down to Melbourne for that first race on the 15th of March. So loads happening. Formula One teams are ramping up, really busy times for them. We're going to have the car launches, which of course I'll cover on this channel as well. And of course, pre-season testing way before we even get down under for the first race. So loads to be talking about in the meantime. And of course, there's loads of questions from you guys, as there always is. Really appreciate them all. We're going to start with this one from Carl Slocum, who says, Happy New Year, Elvis. First Ask Elvis of the Year. What are your hopes for 2020 F1? And do you see the big teams taking their foot off with the current generation cars? I hope that Williams improve massively, McLaren's trajectory is linear, and more of a Red Bull and Ferrari challenge to Mercedes. Well, Carl, Happy New Year to you as well. I couldn't agree more. Those things you've pointed out there. Williams, I mean, it can't go much worse for Williams, so we've got to see a big improvement. I'm sure we will do. I'm really looking forward to seeing how George Russell does, potentially, if that car is a stronger contender this year, how he can mix it. He had a very lonely season last year, but having said that, he did exactly what he needed to do. He beat his teammate in every single race. He was a really good debut in a really difficult situation. Perhaps slightly under the radar for him, which was maybe good, took some pressure off. Now, though, we need to see George Russell stepping up. We need to see the team stepping up. I think we will see an improved Williams. McLaren, I think their trajectory, I think that's going to be linear. We saw a big step forward last year, which, again, a bit like the Williams situation, they had a really difficult 2018. So 2019 had to be a step forward, and it was. And now they're building something at Woking, which all looks to be heading in the right direction. The management tier have all sort of settled down a bit. Great driver pairing. Both of them really, really strong, and such a vibrant mood around the place, which we haven't seen there for a long time. So really fully expect that to continue. Red Bull and Ferrari challenge to Merc. I mean, yes, we just don't know. The thing with that is that it's so finely balanced at the front, isn't it? It's just tiny little details. Merc got, most things right. Or they got less wrong is probably the way to look at it. Ferrari got too much wrong. They made too many mistakes. They had a car that was quick enough on many occasions, but they let themselves down. So if they can get that side, operational side, correct, get that right, absolutely they should be able to challenge Mercedes. Red Bull, I think we could have something strong from them. If that Honda engine takes another step forward, which all accounts it seems like it might well do, there's nothing to say they can't put a proper championship challenge together over the course of 2020. And I think that's what I'm most looking forward to answer your question for 2020, is an ever-closing field, particularly at the front, but also the midfield as a separate group. Although they're not close to the front, the midfield is going to be closer than ever. The front few should be closer than ever. And that's what's going to happen in 2020. This, in theory, on paper, should be the closest year we've had in this hybrid era. The regulations are staying stable, of course, technical and more or less, and sporting as well to some extent. And that's what happens. Stable regulations tend to make people converge in terms of their performance. What I suspect could well happen, and this will be a disappointment if it does, is that for 2021, when we bring in the brand new regulations and everyone's really excited about what they bring, the chances are we'll come off the back of a wonderful 2020 season where everything was really close into a 2021 where somebody does a better job than the rest and leaps away with it. So, but for 2020, I think there are really high hopes that we should have more of what we had in 2019, which was great, wasn't it? I hope you'll agree. More of that and even closer in the various battles up and down the field. So I think there's loads to look forward to. I'm really excited about 2020. I think this could be a really, really strong season, one of the best. And I have to say that last year was probably one of the best for a long time as well. Craig Ferguson says, can you make a video explaining why Haas and Williams have problems with tyres and what are these problems? Well, look, they had both of those teams had a really difficult 2019. Williams, largely aero-based problem, something that was kind of baked into their design, their chassis design. I guess you can equate it a little bit to what McLaren had the year before last, where they had this conceptual design problem that meant they had an inherent aero problem that they couldn't just fix. It wasn't just something that you could bolt a new wing on and it would recover it. You know, for McLaren, that was about the shape and the design of the chassis, not something that's quick and easy or cheap to recover from. I think they would have learned from all of that. They have they say they have an understanding. In fact, they had an understanding early in 2019 of what that was. It's just that they couldn't do anything about it because of the significance of the problem. So their problem is largely around tyres, and it's about getting those tyres for both Williams and Haas, getting those tyres into this narrow operating window, but then once they're in there, keeping them in it. That was where they struggled over and above most other teams. And the reasons behind that can be a number of things, but it is often aero-based because your aerodynamic downforce levels are what obviously push the car into the tarmac. The more aero you've got on, the more grip level you've got, the harder you can push the car and therefore push the tyres. The more force you're putting through those tyres into the tarmac, and therefore the more energy you can put through them, which keeps the heat up. Now, for Haas particularly, what they were suffering a lot with was on circuits where they had a lot of perhaps long straights and low energy corners, if you like. They really struggled to keep the temperature in those tyres. And what happens then is the tyre goes through a graining phase where the top surface of the tyre just rolls away in little tiny balls of rubber. As the top surface gets really hot with a friction between that and the road surface, but the core of the tyre doesn't come up to temperature at the same rate as the surface, and therefore you have this huge discrepancy between tyre surface temperature and the tyre core temperature, if you like, and that's when you get this graining phase where you get these little lines appearing on the surface of the tyre. The top layer of rubber just rolls off and it loses grip. When you lose grip, you just accentuate that graining phase as the car starts to slide. Now what you need to be able to do is bring that temperature of the whole tyre up together with the surface. Cars with good aerodynamic downforce are able to push through that graining phase if they get it, leaning on the tyre, but also bringing that tyre up to temperature because the car's not sliding so much. You bring the bulk of the tyre up to temperature, and therefore you can recover from the graining phase and bring the tyre into that window. Haas really struggled with that, and I think Williams to some extent had the same because their car was so aero inefficient. They weren't able to push, which means they couldn't lean on the tyre to generate temperature. If they leant on the tyre, it would start to slide and they would lose grip or they would overheat the surface. But because they didn't have the aerodynamic downforce, they couldn't push the car hard enough to generate the downforce. So the whole thing ends up spiralling out of control, and it's this circular problem that they can never really overcome and never really get out of. For Haas, of course, there were certain circuits where it was less of an issue because the circuit nature meant that you weren't cooling tyres down. There are ways to overcome it, of course. You can start to work with things like your brakes to emanate heat from the brakes through the rim and into the core of the tyre, and that's what they were desperately trying to do, but they just didn't have enough to be able to overcome it. And the tyres are so temperature sensitive nowadays in Formula One that if you don't have enough scope within your chassis design, within your car's performance and the chassis dynamics to control tyre temperature through driving style and car setup, you just are at the sort of luck really of the circuit nature, whether it suits that little window that your car has. So I hope that makes some sense, but it was basically problems for both of those teams around tyre temperature and keeping the tyre in that window, and that all stems from everything from aerodynamic problems that they might have had, chassis dynamic problems in terms of being able to control things like weight transfer, how much the car leans from one side or the other, how much energy it puts through its tyres. If you can control those things, you can start to control tyre temperature, and that's what the big teams, the most successful teams, that's what Mercedes were very, very good at. They had a number of tools on their car that allowed them to to control that tyre temperature, not just through driving style, but by opening up various elements of the brake drums to allow heat to emanate, by probably adjusting things like the suspension setup to allow more roll or less roll, and therefore put more energy into the tyre itself. So it's a complex thing. I hope that makes some sense. But I think both Williams and Haas had such inherent problems in their car. They were slightly hamstrung for the season when it became apparent that the tyres were so temperature sensitive, and that was perhaps their biggest issue. Hopefully they can both start to overcome it. I have to say, when we had all this talk of changing the tyres for 2020, and of course we've now decided we're going to stick with the 2019 tyres, people like Haas really will have been the most upset by that, because they will have wanted a new tyre they can work with. They struggled so much getting to grips with the 2019 tyres, and now they've got to face them again in 2020. So let's hope their chassis design can overcome some of the problems that they had last year round. Neil Roberts says, which 3 drivers and teams from before your time in F1 would you most like to have worked with, and why? Goodness, that's an interesting one. In terms of the drivers, I would have absolutely loved to have worked with Senna, for obvious reasons, I guess. I would have loved to have worked with James Hunt, probably again for obvious reasons, but I imagine, I worked with Kimi, who slightly modelled himself on James Hunt, and we had just the best laugh, both in the garage but also away from the racetrack. If you've read my book, you'll know about some of those. I imagine James Hunt was just that times 10, so that would have been amazing. I think I would have loved to work with Schumacher in the early days. Now, Schumacher wasn't necessarily before my time. He was one of our biggest rivals for many years, but I think I would have loved to have worked with Schumacher when he first came into the sport. I had this amazing opportunity when I worked with Lewis when he first came into the sport, seeing him as a rookie, seeing how he worked his way into Formula One, how he adapted to Formula One, how he kind of grew within those first couple of seasons as a person and certainly as a Formula One driver, seeing the star quality that Lewis had back then. I imagine that was very similar for those who worked with Michael Schumacher back in the very early days, and I'd love to have been part of that process. He went on, of course, to be such a legend, just like Lewis has. And now, of course, I look back at my time with Lewis and I see lots of those qualities that now you kind of look back and go, yeah, I can see why he's become a 6-time world champion and still going strong. And I imagine those who worked with Michael were exactly the same. So I guess that would be those would be the 3 for me: Senna, Schumacher, and James Hunt. Teams, I don't know. I really don't know about teams. I guess a little bit like a driver, there's always a little draw towards Ferrari. Would it have been nice at some point to work with Ferrari? I think only on a sentimental level. I think the reality of working at Ferrari is very different. And I know lots of my friends and colleagues have worked at Ferrari and actually found it quite difficult, because it's a very different environment to be at the Ferrari, such a pressure cooker environment. I think this is probably why they have some of the operational issues they've had right now, is that it's not necessarily a nice place to work. It's not a particularly forgiving, or it's not a place where you as a mechanic, engineer, driver, or anybody for that matter have an awful lot of freedom to kind of express yourself, to work outside of your comfort zone. And that's the kind of thing that I think gets the best out of people, giving people that freedom. That's why Mercedes has worked so well, because they've done exactly that. So Ferrari, I would have loved to have pulled on the red shirt, maybe just once or twice, just to say I've done it. I guess where else? Some of the really old school teams I would have loved to have been at. I'd love to have been at James Hunt's team back in the day, because how cool would that have been? Hesketh, when they started up, that was just an absolute party team. That would have been amazing. So yeah, I mean, those are the things that I guess you look back on history and think it would have been great to have been part of some of those. So I hope that answers your question. Kay says, in the 70s, all top F1 teams and drivers had Cosworth engines, but different chassis. How do you think F1 would be today if Merck, Ferrari and Red Bull all used the same engine? Would smaller teams be more competitive and winning races? No, I don't think so. I think back in the 70s, things were very different. It was a much more equalised playing field because, you know, what you can buy nowadays with having extra money is quite a significant advantage. I know you could always buy an advantage in Formula One by having more money than someone else, but I think now that's been accentuated because of the technologies that are available, the tooling, the simulation tools, those kind of things. Because nowadays we've got very limited track testing, for example. If you've got really advanced and impressive simulation tools, things like CFD, that kind of stuff, that's a huge advantage because you can be running that in the background, you know, almost constantly. And those are where your biggest advantages come from, because when you get to a racetrack, you're already streaks ahead of those who perhaps can't afford some of those tools. So I don't think it's necessarily that nowadays if you gave everyone the same engine it would be equalised, because look, Williams, who came last with just a single point last year, had the same engine as the guys who walked away with the championship. So it's nowhere near as simple as just being an engine formula. I think back in the beginning of the hybrid era, for example, it was much more an engine formula, whereas now, and actually Williams, great example again, in the beginning of the hybrid era, with Williams having that Mercedes power unit and it being so strong compared to some of the others, it did bring them right up the field. But over time, the engines or the power units have started to converge, so now I don't think there's a huge difference, certainly in terms of power levels, between a Ferrari, even a Honda nowadays, and a Mercedes at times. So I don't think it's necessarily the equaliser that it perhaps once was. So I don't think if you gave everyone the same engine, it would necessarily mean that we'd have small teams winning races. Potentially, it could start to close up the field because all of your development then goes into things like chassis, aero, perhaps smaller marginal gains than the big development that goes into engines and power units in the early phase of a regulation change like the hybrid era, for example. So I don't think it's the answer to everything. I actually like the idea that we're developing different strands of technology with different manufacturers. And don't forget, having different engine manufacturers at the moment is what's propping up our sport. They are, you know, some of the biggest investors in our sport, and without them, we'd actually, in the current situation, Formula One would be at a bit of a loss. So we need the engine manufacturers, we need some sort of competition between them. We've got to try and encourage that until we can find a new model to base Formula One on, I guess. Okay, a Formula E question now from K Kukat on Twitter. He says, Tarmac, for your ongoing excellence. Thank you very much, appreciate it. Question, when will Formula E finally allow individual chassis development, likely subject to cost cap, so that teams can construct beyond just powertrains to innovate and compete and so much more? Well, the answer to that is that I don't think they will allow chassis development in Formula E, because that's absolutely not what Formula E is about. Developing a chassis doesn't really add anything to the overall goals of Formula E, which is about developing the electric drivetrain and batteries, these things that will be much more relevant to road cars of the future. Developing a carbon fibre single-seater monocoque chassis has really limited development potential in the outside wider world. So by keeping that standard and allowing the teams just to focus on those really key elements like the motors, the drivetrains, the power inverters, and of course behind the scenes we've got people like McLaren and their partners developing this battery. We've had Williams doing that in the past. Those are the technologies that Formula E want to be part of the ongoing development process for. So I don't think we're going to see chassis development being opened up, and I actually agree with that decision not to. So I'd love to know what you think. I know it's an alien concept to those of us who've always followed Formula One and other top-level single-seater racing championships to some extent, but I actually think it's a really good way that Formula E have gone about it. And apart from anything else, as you say there, it does keep costs down to a minimum. So I think they're going about it in the right way, and I think actually they'll continue to do that. All right, Nate Smith has this question about Red Bull and Max Verstappen. He says, hey Mark, do you think Red Bull hurt their championship potential by building a car to Max's very specific on-the-nose preferences? Neither Albon or Gasly are 4/10 slower on raw pace, in my opinion, and maybe a more balanced car would be better for the whole season. That's an interesting question there, and I'm not sure if the absolute right answer to this, because I'm not sure there is one necessarily. It does depend on the team. If you think about Ferrari over the years, they've clearly had a number one driver. It was Schumacher for many, many years, wasn't it? Everything was centred and focused around him. The chassis of the car was designed around his preferences. And the other guy in the second car was an out-and-out number two. Everybody knew that, and they were there to back up Schumacher. It was all about catapulting Schumacher to the world title in every given season. Red Bull are starting to build something similar. It's not how they've necessarily set out, but now they've got a situation where if they can't perform, if they can't deliver a world championship for Max Verstappen, he will leave. And this is their final year to really try and convince him to stay. So from a political side of things, they need to convince him, they need to convince Max's dad, who's a big part of the Max Verstappen machine. They need to convince him that he's their main man, and they're going to throw everything at making Max world champion. Because ultimately, most drivers don't care in which car they become world champion in. If they can become world champion in a Alfa Romeo or in a Haas, he would take it. He'd take it tomorrow. Most drivers would, because when they were kids, they all set out to get into Formula One, and when they get into Formula One, their absolute dream is to be world champion. They don't set out to be a Red Bull world champion. Max Verstappen set out to be a Formula One world champion. So the idea of Red Bull centering everything or throwing everything now towards Max is understandable in that sense, in a political sense. They don't necessarily have the next Max Verstappen just waiting in the wings to step up. They've got Alex Albon, did a great job in the second half of last season when he stepped up. He's now got to step up himself, and he's got to prove himself as a worthy contender for race wins, and that that Red Bull should be throwing some development and some resource and some commitment behind him as well. But at the moment, it's Max that's been doing that. He's been doing that for a few years, and that's where they see their biggest opportunity lying. So, yes, could it be that as a team, maybe they could have done better in a Constructors' Championship with a car that suits both drivers, with both drivers picking up more points. But at the end of that, Max Verstappen would leave, he would go to Ferrari, or would go to Mercedes, and then where would Red Bull be for the following year? So they do, in a sense, have to be seen to be throwing everything at Max, and that's where they see it. If they can win a World Championship with Max, they would take that over and above winning a Constructors' Championship and then having Max leave the following season, in my opinion. So that's, I think, why they're doing it, and I can understand it. But I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Do you think that they should be balancing their car? And if that's indeed what they've done, I mean, there's nothing actually to suggest that they have done that. Of course, Gasly and Alex Albon weren't there in the development phase of each of those cars, so they kind of got what they got. Max was there developing the whole thing, so it's natural that it's been developed towards Max's liking. But, is that right? As a philosophy, should they be picking one driver and throwing everything at them, or is it better to balance it and spread the love around the team? Let me know. Pop a comment down below there. Right, Razvan Goldstein says, you might have been asked this before, but I'm really curious. Which skills that you learned while in F1 are you using regularly today? Except changing your car's tyres really fast? Good question. And there are loads. And I would say, Formula One is this, there's so much attention to detail in Formula One. And because I worked at McLaren, particularly under the Ron Dennis era, that level of attention to detail was head and shoulders above most other teams in Formula One. So I always say to people that, Ron Dennis undoubtedly has OCD, and therefore he expected everyone at McLaren to sort of have a level of OCD themselves. And when I went into Formula One and went into McLaren, I don't think I ever had any OCD, but I definitely had some when I came out. It rubbed off on me. So to answer your question, things that whether it's skills or just traits that I've picked up, I definitely now get annoyed by things that are just not right. I mean, my wife will tell you, if the little bin liner around the edge of the kitchen bin is poking out of the edge of the bin, drives me mad. I've got to go and tuck it back in again, because at McLaren that would have been unacceptable. So stuff like that, little things like that, have definitely rubbed off on me. But I also, in a positive sense, I do think that attention to detail, that the idea that no challenge is too big, we've just got to get the job done, that's absolutely something that I've taken away. And I think that now helps me in everything I do, because I won't, if I've got a goal, I won't stop until I've achieved it. And sometimes, you know, in Formula One, that's what you've got to do. The race won't be moved if you're not ready. So you have to be ready. So punctuality is something that I've got, is a big thing for me. And attention to detail, focus and drive to get a challenge completed are all things that I may have had to some extent before going into Formula One, but absolutely now I've come away with even more of. So I actually take that as a massive positive. I think it helps me now in life, and hopefully helps me to be more successful in all the other things that I do and have done since. Amarok says, when the batteries are full on an F1 car, does that reduce the effectiveness of KERS braking, or does the excess energy go elsewhere? Yes, that's absolutely true. When the batteries are full, you have very limited or no engine braking from the MGU-K, because that energy that's harvested using the K, so the MGU-K, that motor generator unit, in harvest mode, that is what's put resistance through that motor directly connected to the rear wheels of the car, and that's what slows the car down. That's what the engine brake, or the KERS braking, KERS, ERS braking, or energy harvesting is doing. It's slowing the car down by putting resistance through the motor, turning that motor into a generator, and by the rolling of the inertia of the car moving, the rolling of the wheels, that turns that generator, putting energy back into the battery. Well, if that battery's full, that energy can't go anywhere. So absolutely, it does affect ERS braking at that phase when your battery's absolutely full. That's all, of course, worked out long before we even get to the racetrack through very advanced simulations. They have a very good idea of what state of charge levels they should be at, how much energy recovery they have at different state of charge levels. Of course, they still do get deployment, because first of all, they can deploy from the battery, but also the MGU-H can be independent. So energy from the MGU-H can go directly to the K and then used to power the car, rather than having to go via the battery. So if the battery's full, the MGU-H can still harvest, but that doesn't affect engine braking or energy recovery braking, if you want to put it that way. It's the K that does the slowing down of the car rather than the H. And if the battery's full, that energy that's generated can't go into the battery itself. All right, Hamburglar says, given the levels of CAD analysis, how did Alfa Romeo manage to fail a crash test? Could this be a one-off poor construction, or is this a design issue that could leave them with no car for testing? Good point. So if you didn't hear that, the Alfa team did fail one of the FIA crash tests. And what happens in this situation is all new chassis, together with other parts of the car like noses, rear impact structures, side impact structures, have to go through a series of what they call impact tests. The FIA have to do the official ones, and they have to sign that off to be able to allow the car to take part in the championship. It's a safety thing. Now, the teams will often do their own crash testing in-house to simulate those, to make sure they're able, they're ready before they go to the FIA, the official FIA crash test. So they'll often crash test nose cones and things like that in-house as well. What seems to have happened here is that this is the chassis itself. I'm not sure exactly which one of the impact tests it was, but it's failed. Now, you might look at that and go, how on earth could a Formula One team fail such a simple thing as a crash test? Well, it's not necessarily a simple thing. First of all, we're talking about massive loads. So we are talking extreme loading. And if you ever watch one of these crash tests, it is scary to watch. Particularly when you put, your life and soul into a chassis, into designing and manufacturing a chassis, you put it on this rig and they squeeze it, or a nose cone, you squeeze it to the point where the thing's flexing and you're sort of wincing watching it. It's so terrifying to see. But those are the loads that it's being put under, obviously all for good reason. But as a Formula One team, you want to design something that just passes that test, because anything more than that will cost you in terms of weight. To make it that strong, there's a penalty in terms of weight in the construction of that chassis. So you want to be, like with everything in Formula One, as close to the limit as you can, and often that's why the thing's flexing when you're watching it. It's flexing and you feel like it's about to shatter, but hopefully the idea is it passes the test and then it comes away and survives. So what's happened here, I would imagine, is that it's just gone the wrong side of that very fine line. Now, it could be something in terms of its, one-off poor construction. That's unlikely because the construction process is so well and carefully controlled, if you like. It's probably unlikely that would be the case. Much more likely to be the case is that the design is just too on the limit. Now, could it mean they might have a car for testing? What it definitely will do is put the whole schedule back, because that chassis was destroyed. You can't ever use that chassis again. So that would have been chassis number 1, I imagine, which means they'll have to expedite chassis number 2 or 3, or 2 and 3 probably, through the system, whereas they might have thought they had a lot more time to get those chassis ready. They've now got to rush it through. So everything will be now a compromise, trying to get that rushed through and brought up to speed to make sure they can, first of all, make the changes to the design that they feel like they need to do, and then get the thing manufactured and then through another crash test. So it's not a great situation. It's a nightmare for a Formula One team, because you work to such tight deadlines before pre-season testing that this is the last thing you really want to find. But it's also not hugely uncommon. It's happened loads of times. It will happen again, because teams are looking for the finest margins. They want to pass these tests, as I say, by the finest of margins. Sometimes you'll end up the wrong side of that line. Right, there we go. That is it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed that one. I know this is a fairly basic video. I'm sat in one room for the whole video. I appreciate that. This year is not going to be like that. There will be some of them, but I'm going to try and be more dynamic. I'm going to try and get out and about. I've got a lot of videos planned and already in the making, which you'll get to see over the next weeks and months. Some of them I hope you'll really, really enjoy. Some really interesting stuff that I've been able to get some access to, or will get some access to. So stay tuned. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. And stick with the channel, because you won't miss another one. Hit the notification bell and you'll know as soon as a video is uploaded. But yeah, loads of really interesting, exciting stuff planned for the channel. So thank you if you've been with me from the beginning. I hope there'll be more of the same, and better as well. If you're new to the channel, go back, check out some of my old videos. There's loads of really interesting stuff on there, I hope you'll find. And as I say, hit subscribe and there'll be plenty more to come. Thanks ever so much, guys. As I said at the beginning, Happy New Year. Oh, don't forget, before you go anywhere, when you leave this video, go and set your video at home, your reminder, your DVR or whatever, Discovery Channel. If you're in the UK, 9 PM tonight, Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car. I've been banging on about it for months. Tonight is the premiere. It launches tonight, Monday the 6th of January, 9 PM, Discovery Channel UK. If you don't catch tonight, or if you're watching this video after it's already gone out, don't worry, it's on repeat. But also every Monday at 9 PM for the next 8 weeks is when the series will roll out. If you're not in the UK, it will be going worldwide, so you'll be able to catch it almost everywhere. That rollout schedule I haven't got yet. I think if you're in the States, it starts there in February, and everywhere's got their own premiere date. As soon as I know those dates, I will let you all know, but I'd love to know your thoughts on it. If you've watched it, drop me a line, let me know what you think. It was a lot of fun to make. I had great fun, I really enjoyed it, so I hope you enjoy it as well. But for now, guys, that's it. Thank you very much, and I will see you back very, very soon with another video. Ta-da!